If you take a look at Pokemon in the year 1996 with Red and Green Japan, and you look at Pokemon today in Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, it's safe to say the games have changed and evolved a ton since their inception. I don't mean this in just the sense of graphics, game designs, and things of that sort. Pokemon has changed and added a ton of game mechanics since the 90s, refining their formula. In today's video, we will be going over every mechanic change and addition in Pokemon history. At least, hopefully all of them. I might miss one or two. If I do, be sure to yell at me in the comments. This will also be part of a multi-part series. Eventually we'll dive into move changes and Pokemon base stat changes, so be sure to subscribe for that. We're on our way to 5,000 subs by the end of the year, and I would really appreciate you subbing and helping us out. While you're down there, drop a like if you enjoy, and let's jump right into it. Going into Generation 2, we had a ton of big changes. The first major addition would have to be the Dark and Steel type being added to the game. This was in an attempt to balance out the type chart that felt a little unbalanced in the original games. In particular, the laughably broken Psychic typing. Psychic types were only resisted by themselves in the first generation, had 0 immunities, and only had 2 weaknesses in Bug and Ghost. However, this was functionally 0 weaknesses, as Ghost moves like Shadow Ball did not exist until future generations, and Bug types were weak and slow, and their stab options and moves like Pin Missile did 0 damage if you were even able to get them off. The Dark and Steel type fixed this problem. Steels now function as a solid resistance to it and many other typings, and Dark functions as an immunity and a typing that can hit Psychics super effectively. However, this isn't the only major change this generation. In fact, there are a ton more. The next addition I'd like to talk about is the addition of held items. It's hard to imagine what competitive Pokemon would look like today without them, and we have Gold and Silver to thank for that. Today, we have an insane amount of viable items, with a ton more introduced every generation. In Generation 2, the pool was much smaller. Mint Berry was used in the generation to combat status in either opposing sleep moves or waking up a user after using a rest to shrug off damage or opposing status, like a beta version of Chesto Berry today. The type boosting items were also introduced, but they weren't that great back then, and saw an increase in their boosting capabilities in later generations. However, quite possibly the most important held item in Pokemon history was introduced in the original item generation. And honestly, it's probably the first item you think of when you think held items. Yep, leftovers. This self-healing item has been a staple in both competitive Pokemon and in-game. It is insane to think that even over 20 years later, this is still used to such an insane degree. As a singles player, I of course have to mention the addition of entry hazards. In this generation, it was just spikes, and you could only set up a max of 1 layer at a time. The concept of entry hazards would become synonymous with single battles and at later points absolutely meta-defining, and they got their origins here alongside Rapid Spin to remove them. Another big change is the special stat was also split this generation. For those of you unaware, in the original games there was just 1 special stat, accounting for both special attack and defense. In Generation 2, these stats were split, to the dismay of many Pokemon. Sorry, Executor. We also have the addition of another metagame warping move in Hidden Power. This 70 base power move could be any typing, and depended on the Pokemon IVs or individual values. This essentially gave every Pokemon coverage of any typing. Thankfully not too strong though. Pokemon like Raikou and Zapdos love this, giving that illustrious Bolt Beam coverage with Hidden Power Ice. They would abuse this in combination with Rest Talk, another addition of GSE to stay healthy. Rest would heal a Pokemon to full and put them to sleep for 2 turns, and Sleep Talk would randomly call in another move in its arsenal while asleep. Rest Talk would remain prevalent in future generations, but it was especially potent in Gen 2. This is because in Generation 2 only, if a Pokemon called Rest while using Sleep Talk, it would heal the Pokemon back to full and reset their 2-turn sleep counter. This is one of the main reasons this generation is often seen as the stall generation. In future generations, calling Rest upon a Sleep Talk turn would just result in the move failing. Another metagame defining move was introduced in this generation as well. Funny how that works, huh? That move was Pursuit. Pursuit was a weak Dark type move that could double in power if the target switched out, but it would also still hit them before they switched out. To my limited GSC knowledge, I do not believe Pursuit was super common at the time, but it became a very prevalent part in the metagame in future generations, to every Ghost and Psychic type's dismay. The Explosion moves also saw a big buff in Generation 2. Not only did Self-Destruct and Explosion go from 130 to 170 base power, and 200 to 250 base power respectively, that wasn't even their true base power. See, back in the early generations, these moves would half the target's defenses before exploding, basically making them 400 and 500 base power respectively. In generations where this buff existed, Boom would become an instant KO to anything not immune or resistant to it. Finally, we can move on to Generation 3. Man, Gen 2 had way more mechanic changes than I initially thought. ADV had some major changes of their own, the biggest of which being Pokemon abilities. These are now seen as integral to any Pokemon's design and viability, and it all started in the Hoenn region. Abilities that are still game defining today were in the first batch of abilities, like Intimidate, Sandstream, Drizzle, and Drought. Weather-setting abilities being introduced would make incredible impact on competitive Pokemon in general, and see a ton of changes and reworks throughout the series' lifetime. But we'll talk about that soon. We also got the EV system that we still use today. EVs, or a different version of them, still existed in Generation 2, but you could max out every one of a Pokemon's stats. Starting in Generation 3, you had a maximum of 510 EVs that you can invest in your Pokemon stats, with a maximum of 252 in one stat. That meant you now had to choose between physically or specially offensive, or specially defensive or physically defensive. This greatly sped up the pace of the game of competitive battles, as not everything was as bulky as they possibly could be. Spikes were also updated to their current form, having a maximum of 3 layers that were able to be set up. This made hazard control, or at bare minimum a team that doesn't really mind hazards, much more important. This was also a lot easier in Generation 3 due to spikes only affecting grounded Pokemon, unlike the soon-to-be introduced Stealth Rocks, which we'll get into soon. Some smaller changes would include Sleep Talk changes. No longer would a Pokemon rest back to full if it called rest on a Sleep Talk turn. Instead, as we said before, the move would just fail. On to Generation 4, and man oh man did DPP bring a ton of changes. First, we have the physical special split. In Generations 1 through 3, the determining factor deciding if an attacking move was physical or special was the typing of the move. The easiest way to remember this is that the EV types, water, fire, grass, electric, dark, psychic, and ice, as well as dragon, were all special attacks. The rest were physical. This immensely benefited some Pokemon like Alakazam, who had access to moves like fire, ice, and thunder punch, giving it elemental coverage off its stronger special attack. This also boned a ton of Pokemon like Crawdon, whose stabs were special typings, so it did not get to use its much stronger physical stat with its stab moves. Generation 4 decided to further classify these moves based on thematic application. To keep up with the elemental punches example, they were now physical, as they could be described as physical punches with the element. No more special attacking Hitmonchan. No longer being restricted by a typing, a water type can now choose between Surf and Waterfall, and a fire type could choose between Fire Blast and Flare Blitz. The split not only allowed any Pokemon to use the attacks that they wanted, but it also made the archetype of mixed attacker so much more viable and strong. And of course, we have to mention Stealth Rock. This new entry hazard changed Pokemon forever. Rocks were not stackable like spikes and could only have one setting on one side of the field at one time. The main difference is they hit every Pokemon, unlike spikes that couldn't hit Pokemon in the air, and they did damage based on typing. The base amount of damage that rocks would do to a Pokemon neutral to the rock typing was 12.5%. If a Pokemon resisted rocks, that would be half to 6%, and if it was weak to it, it would be doubled to 25%. In some cases, if a Pokemon was 4 times weak to rock, it would take 50% for just switching in. This demolished the viability of some Pokemon. Sorry Charizard, and warped an entire meta game around keeping up rocks and preventing them on lead. Even beyond this inaugural generation, Stealth Rock have been arguably the most meta-defining and polarizing aspect of singles competitive Pokemon. You'd find it very rare to see any team that functions with consistent success that did not have a rocker in some capacity. Next up is the choice items. Generation 3 actually introduced the choice band as an item, which boosted the holder's attack by 1.5 times in exchange for locking it into whatever move it clicked first. However, it was in DPP that we got the items of the same vein and the other two prevalent stats, both Choice Scarf for speed and Choice Specs for special attack. This in conjunction with Pokemon getting generally stronger moves like Flare Blitz and Close Combat among many others, as well as the aforementioned physical and special split, meant that breakers were absolutely eating this generation and damage output soared to an all-time high, really beginning the steady power creep that we've seen in competitive Pokemon to this day. We also got some other small changes like Rock types gaining a special defense boost while in Sandstorm. Go Tyranitar! On to our last 2D generation, Gen 5. The first and foremost biggest change that we saw in Generation 5 was the addition of Team Preview. Prior to the generation, your opponent could not see your team members prior to you sending them out, and your lead was predetermined by whatever Pokemon you had in the first slot on your team. This added a big aspect of information gathering and a complex lead metagame design around getting the advantage turn 1 as much as possible. It seemed to really reward those with a deep knowledge of the metagame and common team compositions. This all changed when Zoroark was introduced into the game. Zoroark has an incredibly unique ability called Illusion. Illusion would essentially disguise Zoroark as whatever Pokemon was in the last slide of your party until it took damage. This obviously could not function without 1. Determining the order of your team so that you could choose a Pokemon Zoroark would be disguising itself as, and 2. Giving your opponent an indication that you have Zoroark to begin with. It's not super fair in concept or mechanic otherwise. The funny thing is, Zoroark isn't even particularly good. In fact, it's been pretty terrible traditionally since. However, its presence alone changed competitive Pokemon forever, adding in Team Preview and getting rid of the lead metagame entirely. The next biggest change that came in Black and White was the introduction of the Dream World or hidden abilities. A ton of old and new Pokemon gained a new ability on top of what they previously had, skyrocketing the viability of some Pokemon. Some that come to mind would be Multi-Scale Dragonite, Moxie Salamence, Poison Heal Gliscor, and even more importantly, Drizzle Politoed and Drought Ninetales. This introduction of the permanent rain and sun abilities on Pokemon not named Groudon Kyogre was massive for competitive Pokemon and started the weather wars of the generation. Hidden abilities in general are probably one of the biggest offenders of pushing power creep so far forward, which has also been a defining characteristic of Generation 5. We also saw a big nerf to one of the most commonly used moves in the last 2 generations, Explosion. As noted before, prior to Generation 5, Explosion was a certified nuke. Not only was it a 250 base power move, but it also cut its target's defense in half before damage calculation, essentially making it a base 500 power move. With a choice band or even just a high-ish attack stat, nothing that didn't resist boom or was a ghost type and immune to it just straight dropped. And often, resistances weren't safe either. Starting in Generation 5, Explosion no longer half the target's defense stat, essentially nerfing the move's base power by half, as much to the dismay of Pokemon like Metagross and Azelf that used it a lot in prior generations. Finally, we have to mention the Gen 5 specific gem items. There's a gem for every single type, and upon using a move of said type, it would be consumed and give that attack a 50% boost. This is probably one of the most tame of all generational gimmicks, and honestly is not considered by many to even be a generational mechanic, and more so just a Gen 5 specific set of items. The only one that ever carried over to the future games was the normal gem, and its power was nerfed to 1.3 times instead of 1.5 times. However, their impact on the Generation 5 metagame was still massive, giving a ton of Pokemon a massive one-time nuke in exchange for a conventional item. In fact, a year ago, gems were banned from Gen 5 OU and deemed unhealthy for the metagame, even though many years had passed since it could be considered a current gen metagame. On to the 3D era and the beginning of the generational mechanic model that Pokemon is still running. The mechanic they introduced this generation was by far the favorite of the Pokemon fanbase to this day and will be returning in Pokemon Legends GA in some capacity. And that, of course, is Mega Evolution. A select number of Pokemon were given access to this mechanic, 46 Pokemon. There were 48 total Mega Evolutions in the game, when accounting for Charizard and Mewtwo's 2 forms. And the basic premise was to take some underwhelming and some not so underwhelming Pokemon and give them a nice stat increase of 100, and also usually change their ability and sometimes typing in exchange for their item slot, as you could only Mega if you were holding your Mega Stone. They are also limited to 1 per battle. As I mentioned, this mechanic is iconic in the eyes of most Pokemon fans, giving them a ton of fun new toys to play with as well as some awesome design upgrades. Generation 6 also gave us our first new typing since Generation 2 and the Fairy type. Fairies really helped a ton in slowing down the terrifying Dragon typing. Before, Dragon had no immunities, and while Steel resisted it, most did not have reliable coverage and could be taken out after some chip, with both ground and fire coverage being really prevalent on Dragons. Fairy gave a whole new immunity to the typing, and Steel and Poison coverage was not as common or splashable in the rest of the meta. Fairy also boasts some great resistances otherwise in Bug, Dark, and Fighting. The Dark resistance in particular is great, as this is actually the great knockoff buff generation. Previous to Generation 6, the move Knockoff was a flat 20 base power, and also removed the item of its target. However, this got buffed big time to a flat base power of 65, which was then increased by a whopping 50% when the target was holding an item that could be knocked off. This buff was massive. Knockoff was a niche but solid utility move already. Being able to get rid of your opponent's item is very, very valuable. However, it becoming such a strong move on top of that was great for Dark types and just physically offensive Pokemon in general. Not to mention, Dark type moves became even more spammable in Generation 6 as the Steel typing lost its resistance to both Dark and Ghost. Poor Metagross is in shambles. Lastly, I have to mention the change to automatic weather abilities. In prior generations when they were available, Drizzle, Drought, Snow Warning, and Sandstream would not only set up their respective weather, but if left interrupted, they would go on indefinitely. The only way to stop the weather would be to reset it with your own. The weather wars that ensued in Generation 5 was a direct product of this mechanic and the new non-Uber Pokemon that gained access to these weather setting abilities, like Ninetales and Politoed. Game Freak likely realized the negative implications of this, especially with some incredibly powerful Megas being added to the game. So starting in X and Y, weather-inducing abilities had a standard 5 turns of length, as if the user was using a weather-setting move. This could be extended to 8 turns in length if the weather-extending item was equipped, such as Damp Rock, Heat Rock, or Smooth Rock. This made weather teams much more skill intensive and not as easily plug and playable. Onto the Alola region of Generation 7. There actually weren't a ton of changes to note here. First off, we of course have to mention Z-moves, the gimmick of Alola. During this generation, a Pokemon could hold a Z Crystal. If that Pokemon had a move of this typing, they would be able to supercharge up this attack for a one-time nuke at their discretion. These also had a positive effect on status moves. For example, let's look at Heatran. If Heatran were to equip a Fire Emblem Z Crystal and use Z Sunny Day, not only would the sun be set up, but Heatran would also get a +1 boost to its speed. There were a ton of fun offensive and utility application of Z moves, and some Pokemon even got custom Z Crystals and moves. For example, the Tapus. If they used Tapunium Z alongside the move Nature's Madness, it would turn into the move Guardians of Alola. From there, instead of shaving off the usual 50% of the target's HP number, it would actually take away 75%. There were downsides and limitations to this mechanic, however. You did miss out on an important item slot, and you could only use one Z move per battle. Even then, they were an integral part of the generation, and in my opinion, a ton of fun to battle with. They also had a major change to the speed mechanic for Pokemon who were Mega Evolving. Previously in Generation 6, a Pokemon would have the same speed set as their original form on the first turn of Mega Evolution. For example, Mega DNC would remain at base 50 speed upon Mega Evolution for the first turn. It would shoot up to 110 on subsequent turns. Because of this, many Megas would have to run Protect to get around this. This includes the aforementioned DNC and Mega Beedrill as prime examples. However, once we switched over to Generation 7, this was no longer the case. This immensely freed up a ton of Mega Pokemon's move slots and in the manner of which trainers could play with them. And for the last change of Generation 7, we have to mention the burn nerf. Prior to Sun and Moon, when a Pokemon was burned, they would take 1/8 of their health as damage at the end of the turn. This was nerfed to a damage output of 1/16 per turn in Generation 7, to the bane of many water Pokemon everywhere. Scald was still a great attack and insanely spammable, but it did not have as much of an insane impact, even out-damaging Leftovers recovery as burns did previously. On to Generation 8, and I could not mention Sword and Shield without of course mentioning Dexit. For those unfamiliar, Dexit refers to the removal of the National Dex, meaning only Pokemon found in Sword and Shield itself were available for use. This had huge implications on every metagame, whether it be singles, VGC, or Draft League. The subsequent DLC shook things up even more by adding new Pokemon each, flipping the metagame on its head twice. We also saw the removal of past gimmicks such as Mega Evolution and Z-moves. A lot of fans were very upset with this change, but I personally really loved it. From a competitive perspective, it kept things changing and feeling much more fresh throughout the generation. We also have to mention the generation's gimmick, Dynamax. Dynamax was interesting to say the least. The Dynamax Pokemon had its HP doubled for 3 turns, and all of their moves were buffed up to higher damage, with generic secondary effects. An example of this would be Max Flare allowing fire moves to automatically set the sun. Status moves were automatically changed to Max Guard, which is a generic max move version of Protect. Some Pokemon had Gigantamax forms specific to them. They would just have different forms aesthetically and gain one specific G-Max move. For example, instead of Max Flare, Gigantamax Charizard's fire moves would turn into G-Max Wildfire. This gimmick was controversial, to say the least. VGC players had a love and hate relationship with it from what I could tell, and singles players despised it. Whether it be Smoke on singles or Draft League, it was pretty much unanimously banned in both formats after just a short bit of time. As a Draft League player myself, D-Max Meta was probably the least fun I have ever had playing competitive Pokemon, and it's not particularly close. Outside of Dexit and D-Max, the Generation 8 did not have many mechanic changes. Dynamic speed control was also introduced, and is really only applicable in doubles, which is far from my expertise. Explained in super simple terms, if speed tiers change mid-turn due to Tailwind, Electro Web, Icy Wind, or anything else, that change would be calculated immediately instead of after the turn. At least if I'm explaining that right. Doubles players, please do not come for my head if not. We also saw some huge additions item-wise and heavy-duty boots, but as meta-defining as these shoes were, they were not a mechanic. If you'd like a video on items specifically, let me know and we can cover the TIMs in that video more in depth. Finally, we move on to current gen, Generation 9. In Scarlet and Violet, we saw a fair few big mechanic changes. We, of course, as with Generation 6, 7, and 8, have to mention Scarlet and Violet's big gimmick. This was Terastallization. If you chose to Terastallize a Pokemon, it would then change into that typing for the rest of the battle. For example, if you teared your Kingambit into a fighting type, it would change its defensive typing from Dark Steel to pure fighting. It would also then gain Stab, or same type attack bonus, on its low kick. Conversely, if you were to tear your Kingambit into a Dark type, it would shed Steel typing and become a pure Dark type. But what about the add stat boost? Kingambit's already a Dark type. Well, if a Pokemon teared into a typing they already were, like Kingambit going Terra Dark, then you would gain an additional multiplier on your stab typing you tear it into. This means counter cleaves and sucker punches would now have a 2x multiplier on them, making them incredibly strong. What if you tear it into a typing that you didn't have natural coverage for? For example, King Gambit terrestrializing into a fairy type. Fret not, because we have Terra Blast, a move that turns into the typing that you've teared into. It can either be physical or special and is dependent on the highest attacking stat of the user if they're Terrat. Think of it as a buffed up hidden power for Terra Pokemon only. This combination of traits makes Terra the most versatile generational gimmick by far, giving it plenty of offensive and defensive application. We also saw huge move pool changes in Generation 9. I have not mentioned anything move pool wise in this video thus far because they aren't mechanics themselves. For example, we didn't mention the plethora of cut moves in Generation 8 like Pursuit and Hidden Power. That's a story for a different video. What we will mention is the loss of home only or transfer only moves. In prior generations, Pokemon learned different moves depending on the game they were in. Despite them maybe not learning the same moves in the next game, they were at least legal through transfer. This changed in Generation 9, when Pokemon Home and Scarlet and Violet made the change to automatically reset transferred Pokemon's moves once they were sent into Scarlet and Violet if they could not be obtained locally. This changed a ton of Pokemon's move pools and heavily restricted older staples. Roost was lost by many Pokemon that had in prior games, like Scizor and Hydreigon. Another big change was the loss of Toxic on a good 80% of the game. Previous to Generation 8, just about every Pokemon in the game learned the TM for Toxic. And while only Pokemon that it thematically made sense for, i.e. poison types and some other examples, could learn it in Sword and Shield, Pokemon could still be transferred in with those moves. Now in Generation 9, they could no longer learn it at all. So fatter Pokemon that would span the move, like Zapdos, Landorus, etc., could no longer put their opponents on a timer. This, plus the PP recovery moves being nerfed, again, another story for the moves-based video, was a huge blow to stall and fatter playstyles, making offense the most prominent playstyle of Generation 9 by far. That's going to be all I have. Again, if I missed something, please let me know. I covered a lot of things though, so maybe some things you didn't know about when it came to old gen mechanics and things like that. Maybe some things you didn't know about new ones. Let me know what you guys think. Again, it took me a long time to write this up and kind of find all the information for this, so if you guys want to sub to the channel, I really appreciate it a ton on our way to 5,000. Yeah, I'll see y'all next time. Later.